Good evening, traveler. You've wandered into myth-taken dreams, a place where timelines tangle, truths wobble, and bedtime stories rewrite history just enough to make it magical. Each tale unfolds from a library that never existed, where historians whisper with poets and facts arrive fashionably late. Tonight, we unspool another tale from the flickering archive because bedtime deserves a version of history to pique the imagination. So fluff your pillow, turn down the logic, and lean into the lore. Once upon a time, in a land far, far, far to the east, there lived a boy named Temujin, who would one day be known as Genghis Khan. Now, Temujin wasn't born with a sword in one hand and a crown in the other. Oh no. He was born on the Mongolian steppe, which, for those who don't know, is a vast, windswept, rather cold place where the idea of indoor plumbing was still many centuries away, and most people had a strong preference for running after their dinner rather than waiting for it to arrive at the table. Temujin's early life was about as pleasant as a cold porridge breakfast. His father was killed when he was just a boy, and his family was left to fend for themselves, which meant eating whatever food they could find, learning how to make their own clothes out of yak fur, and generally trying to avoid getting stomped on by the occasional herd of very large, very angry horses. Now, Temujin was a determined young man. He had a dream. Actually, no, scratch that. He had a vision. He wasn't satisfied with being just another nomadic herder sitting around and complaining about the lack of Wi-Fi. He wanted to unite all the Mongol tribes, which, as you can imagine, were as easy to unite as herding cats, if the cats were all really good at archery and liked to fight each other. But Temujin wasn't the sort to just sit around and complain about things. He decided that if he was going to unite these tribes, he would need a little bit of chutzpah, a bit more than a sword, and perhaps a very large stick. So he started by winning battles, one after the other, using strategy and cunning. He didn't just charge in and swing his sword around like a wildly enthusiastic toddler with a stick. Oh no, Temujin was clever. He'd trick the enemy, use their weaknesses against them, and sometimes he'd even offer to become friends, only to suddenly surround them with his army when they weren't looking. It was all very sneaky, in a cool kind of way. But it wasn't just about winning battles. No, Temujin knew that the secret to being a really good leader wasn't just about strength, it was about loyalty. He didn't believe in, as the Romans would put it, divide and conquer. Instead, he said, let's all stick together and conquer things as one big, happy family. And when his warriors were loyal to him, they really followed him. They didn't just fight hard, they fought like they had a purpose. Now, it's time to talk about Temujin's new title, Genghis Khan. It sounds a bit impressive, doesn't it? A bit you will fear me because I am the great Khan, with a lot of mystery and drama. Genghis Khan meant universal ruler, which, if you ask me, sounds like the title of someone who's about to have way too many crowns and possibly a very busy calendar. But it also meant that Genghis had now become the leader of the Mongols. And when a Mongol leader gets his title, that's when the fun really begins. You see, once Genghis Khan had his army together, it was time for him to do what any sensible conqueror would do, start conquering. And conquer he did, in a very big way. He began by marching west, which in the days before Google Maps was a bit like walking into the unknown, only without the convenience of snacks or rest stops. First, he took on the Jin dynasty, a very powerful empire in northern China. The Jin had rather impractical ideas about defending their empire with huge walls, which, frankly, seemed like a good idea at first. However, Genghis Khan was a man who did not do walls. Instead, he employed a clever tactic called, let's pretend to leave, but actually come back and attack when you least expect it. This worked surprisingly well, and soon enough, the Jin were no longer in charge of their own land. They were Genghised. But Genghis Khan wasn't the sort to stop there. Oh no. Next, he turned his attention to the Khwarezmian Empire, which, frankly, sounds like a name invented by someone who had too much time on their hands and a fondness for the letter Z. Now, the Khwarezmians had made a critical mistake. They insulted Genghis Khan. In fact, they insulted him so thoroughly that Genghis Khan decided that if they wanted an enemy, he'd give them one they'd never forget. So, Genghis unleashed his army on them, which, if you ever find yourself on the receiving end of an entirely unstoppable Mongol army, is not exactly a position you want to be in. The Khwarezmians were so thoroughly defeated that historians still have trouble figuring out exactly how much stuff Genghis took. It's a lot of stuff, by the way. Now, you may be wondering, is Genghis Khan going to keep going? Surely, he can't be that ambitious. Well, he was. Oh, he was. Genghis didn't just want to rule a small patch of land. He wanted to build an empire that stretched from the eastern sea to the western mountains. He wanted a place so big that when people looked at it, they'd say, "Wow, that's one enormous empire, and there's no way we're ever going to find all the people in it to invite to a party." And so, his empire stretched from China to Central Asia, from the Middle East to Russia. His army, which included very fast horse riders, highly skilled archers, and a tendency to never give up, swept through every corner of the known world, defeating cities and empires and leaving people thinking, "Well, I never thought I'd be conquered by a bunch of horse-riding warriors in PJs." But it wasn't just about taking over land. Oh no. Genghis Khan was also quite clever when it came to running his empire. He promoted people based on their skills, not their family name, which was a revolutionary idea. He was also the first person to create a postal system in which letters would be delivered by fast riders, called yam, and he made sure that trade could flow freely across the empire. In a way, he was one of the first people to create a sort of global economy, and not a bad one at that. Eventually, Genghis Khan died, which, as you might imagine, was a bit of a blow to his empire. But, like all good fairy tales, the story didn't end there. His children and grandchildren carried on his work, expanding the empire even further until it became the largest continuous empire in history. It was the empire that would eventually stretch across nearly 1/4 of the entire planet. And what was the moral of the story? Well, the moral is, if you're a young boy who grew up in the cold, windswept plains, and your life is all about survival and determination, then you can certainly rule a bunch of other people's empires too. But most importantly, never underestimate the power of being clever, ambitious, and good at riding horses. The end. Or perhaps the beginning of a much, much bigger story.